These are the most interesting historical photos and unusual objects from the past. Let's get 100,000 subscribers. Abolitionist Sarah Grimke in the United States, mid-1800s. She secretly taught enslaved people to read and later used her own money to send her brother's 3 mixed-race sons to study at Harvard and Princeton. Jewish villagers in the region of Roswitha in Germany occupied Poland during World War II, early 1940s. Polish doctor Eugeniusz Lazowski staged a fake epidemic by giving harmless injections that produced positive tests, so the occupiers quarantined the area. Soviet service dogs on the Eastern Front during the Second World War, 1940s. About 60,000 of these dogs pulled wounded soldiers from the field, carried important documents, laid telephone lines, found millions of mines. Tsutomu Miyazaki, shown here in custody in Japan in the late 1980s, was at the center of one of the country's most shocking criminal cases. His unusual hands became a grim symbol in news reports, turning this investigation into a long-running debate about crime, media. Indian inventor Shivkar Bapuji Talpade, with his experimental aircraft in Bombay, India, in 1895, said to be inspired by the Sanskrit text Vaimanika Shastra. Later stories claimed his unmanned craft flew before the Wright brothers. American patient John Brower Minnick in a Seattle hospital in the late 1970s was recorded at about 1,400 pounds, one of the highest body weights in medical history. Under strict medical care, he later lost around 924 pounds. Group portrait of young women millworkers in Europe around year 1900. Later, people noticed an extra hand on one woman's shoulder with no clear owner, turning this factory photo into a famous unexplained image. Titanic survivors in the year 1912 had to pay $1 for each word when sending a wireless message from rescue ships. One man spent his very last dollar on a single word to his mother, the simple message, safe. Soviet soldier returning home somewhere in the Soviet Union after the Second World War, mid-1940s. All his things fit in one bag, and his child has no shoes. Yet 16 years later, this country would send the first human into space. On an airfield on the Eastern Front during the Second World War, Soviet pilots watch an orphaned boy, adopted by their air regiment, write, "For Mom, for Dad," on a bomb. Minutes later, the bombs will be loaded onto planes and carried beyond the front line. Soviet gymnast Viktor Chukarin, once prisoner number 10491 in German prison camps during the Second World War, is seen here training on the parallel bars in the early 1950s. After surviving 17 camps, including Buchenwald, he went on to win 7 Olympic gold medals. At the top is a court ball at the Imperial Palace in St. Petersburg under Tsar Nicholas II, early 20th century. Below, a line of Russian village women in harness pull a heavy load, a visual contrast often used to show how different lives could be in the same country at the same time. American psychologist and writer Timothy Leary is seen here after his arrest in California in 1970 for possession of illegal substances. In prison, he was given a standard personality test that he had helped create years earlier, and he filled it out in a way that sent him to a low-security gardening job. Soviet soldiers A. Gryaznov, L. Korotiva, and N. Persianinoff on Mount Elbrus in February 1943 after a mission to remove enemy flags from the summit. Their climb on the highest peak of Europe turned a mountain propaganda stunt into a symbol of taking the heights back. Children who survived the Auschwitz camp stand near the gate as Soviet troops arrive in occupied Poland, January 1945. The Red Army found about 7,000 people still alive there, turning this place from a guarded camp into their first moment of freedom. On 22 June 1941, the first day of the German attack on the Soviet Union, the Luftwaffe lost about 250 aircraft, its heaviest single day of the war. Soviet pilots such as Lieutenant Ivan Kalabushkin, who downed 5 planes, and Junior Lieutenant Dmitry Kokorev, who even landed his fighter after a ramming strike. On the 13th November 1943, underground fighter Konstantin Chekhovich carried out a solo sabotage mission in the Porkhov Cinema in occupied Russia during a meeting of German officers. The explosion broke up the command gathering, and hundreds of occupying soldiers, including 2 generals. Engineer Igor Sikorsky stands under his experimental amphibious helicopter during a test near Stratford, Connecticut in April 1941. The machine used floating pontoons instead of wheels so it could lift off from land and then land on water. Chanby, Army Guards march at the tomb of the unknown soldier in Arlington National Cemetery, Virginia, a memorial that has been watched every minute since July 2, 1937. The guards of the 3rd Infantry Regiment keep their post in heat, snow. Staff of the Martin Brothers coffee stand and sandwich shop line up outside their corner location at Touro and St. Claude in New Orleans in the 1940s. The Martin Brothers became famous for serving big, poor boy sandwiches to streetcar workers during a long strike. Japanese migrants sit on the deck of the ship Seattle Maru in 1917, learning Portuguese on their way to a new life in Brazil. Between 1908 and the mid-1930s, more than 100,000 Japanese people would cross the ocean like this. An illustration of a husband taking his wife to a country market in England to offer her to a new partner, a scene from the 19th century. Wife selling was never legal, but in some poor towns, men still used this public ritual as an informal way to end a marriage. A woman is shown with a replica of a scold's bridle, a metal punishment mask used in Britain and parts of Europe between the 15 and 1800s. The frame locked around the head with a plate that held down the tongue so the wearer could not speak. Street scene in Reykjavik, Iceland, in 1943, where one man in a light coat seems to be holding something to his ear like a modern phone. Most researchers think he was just smoking or scratching his head, but the strange pose still fuels stories about secret early gadgets. A German wartime submarine appears on the surface, while 2 huge fins rise from the water beside it in a photo said to be from the 1940s. Some people claim this shows a giant megalodon shark, but experts think it is either a normal shark at the right angle or a later trick image. Log drivers, known as river rats, ride huge chained rafts of logs down the Columbia River in Oregon around 1910. Some lumber rafts on big American rivers stretched for several city blocks, and the men walking on the rolling logs risked serious injury or death if they slipped between them. Native American soldiers of the U.S. Army pose for a portrait during World War I, around 1917 to 1918. About 13,000 Native Americans served in the war, even though most of them would not receive United States citizenship until 1924. Japanese-American volunteers from the Hana Hongwanji Gakuen Temple on Maui pose in uniform as members of the 442nd Infantry Regiment around 1941. This unit of mostly Hawaiian and mainland Japanese Americans later became one of the most decorated U.S. Army units of the Second World War. Yasuke was an African warrior who reached Japan in the 1580s and entered the service of warlord Oda Nobunaga. No real portrait of him survives, so images like this are modern recreations based on written records of his life at Nobunaga's court. Contestants line up at the first official Miss Olympia Women's Bodybuilding Contest in Philadelphia in 1980. At that time, judges favored a lean, athletic look with clear muscle but far less extreme size than later decades of the sport. Country singer Johnny Cash walks with his first wife Vivian Liberto in the United States in the 1950s. Because of her dark hair and Italian heritage, some newspapers wrongly claimed she was black, and the couple received hate mail. Margaret and Matilda Peters, nicknamed Pete and Repeat, were sisters who dominated black tennis tournaments in the United States during the 1940s and 1950s, playing in a separate tennis circuit when major events were closed to them. Thomas Fuller, an enslaved African man brought to colonial America in 1724, became known for his rare gift for mental math. Without formal schooling, he could solve huge number problems in his head so fast that educated visitors had to check his answers on paper. Alberta Christine Williams King, mother of Martin Luther King Jr., was a church musician and leader at Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, Georgia. In June 1974, she was shot and killed by a gunman while playing the organ during service. Gertrude "Ma" Rainey, pictured with her band in the early 1900s, was one of the first stars to take the raw Southern blues onto big stages and into recording studios. Her powerful stage shows and records linked vaudeville and classic blues. 2-year-old Stephen Damon disappeared on Halloween Day, 1955, after his mother briefly left him and his baby sister outside a bakery on Long Island, New York. The baby was found unharmed in her stroller a few blocks away, but Stephen was never found. Teenager Randy Gardner took part in a sleep experiment in San Diego in 1964, staying awake for about 11 days and 25 minutes under constant medical observation. His record still stands because modern researchers now consider extreme sleep loss too risky to repeat. In British and Irish factory towns in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, some people worked as professional knocker-uppers, paid to wake workers. They used long poles or pea shooters to tap on bedroom windows at set times, a job that vanished once cheap alarm clocks arrived. French doctor Marcel Petiot, later found responsible for many hidden crimes, vanished from wartime Paris and reappeared with a beard and the new name Henri Valery. Under that identity, he joined the French forces, became a captain. Indian soldiers formed the outline of the country during the first Republic Day parade in New Delhi in 1950. The march marked the day India's new constitution took effect, turning it from a British dominion into a republic with its own president. An Indian family poses for a studio-style portrait with their cows, reflecting how important cattle are in daily life and tradition. In many rural areas, these animals are valued not only for milk and farm work, but are cared for almost like extra members of the household. In a classroom in Ghana around 2018, teacher Richard Appiah Akoto carefully drew the Microsoft Word screen in chalk so his students could learn computer skills without any computers. The photos of his lessons spread worldwide and brought donations of real computers to his school. 16-year-old Catherine Gilnag was traveling in third class on the Titanic in April 1912 when she was placed in a lifeboat and rescued by the ship Carpathia. She later said she did not realize the Titanic had sunk until she reached New York. Soviet tank crewmen on the Leningrad front in 1944 pose with their small pet fox, nicknamed Trofeika, sitting in the open hatch. Frontline units sometimes kept rescued animals like this as mascots, a brief reminder of normal life during long months at war. Engineers Alexei Ananenko, Valery Bespalov, and Boris Baranov prepared to enter flooded halls beneath the Chernobyl power station, Soviet Union, May 1986. They opened the valves to drain the poisoned water and quietly stopped a second huge crisis that could have reached much of Europe. Yuri Gagarin eats from a camp pot during a simple forest picnic in the Soviet Union, 1962. Just 1 year after his flight into space, the most famous man on Earth relaxes in a quiet tent camp far from parades and cameras. Teenage students from a trade school work on artillery shells at a Soviet factory in 1943. Some of them beat the daily plan by more than 3 times, so school kids were treated as full factory workers. Soviet anti-aircraft guns fire into the night sky over Leningrad during the long siege in World War II. The city endured 872 days of hunger and cold, with civilian losses higher than the bombing of Hamburg, Dresden, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki together. The fences of Auschwitz in Poland mark the place where the camp was freed in 1945. For many former prisoners, years of extreme hunger had harmed their bodies so much that even careful feeding after freedom could not save their lives. The leader of Germany sits at a table in the early 1930s when new animal protection laws were introduced. In 1933, his government became the first to ban the making of foie gras because of concern over force-feeding of birds. Charles Pretty Boy Floyd appears here in a police mugshot and a newspaper list of public enemies in the early 1930s. During some bank raids, he is said to have burned mortgage papers, turning him into a strange legend among debt-ridden farmers while officers hunted him across the country. British prank lover Horace de Vere Cole, seen here in costume with his friends, was a poet and aristocrat who turned real life into a stage. In one of his most famous tricks, he seated bald men in a theater so their shining heads spelled out a rude word perfectly visible from the royal box of King Edward VII. Nina Pavlovna Petrova, a Soviet woman sharpshooter born in 1893, stands with her rifle and medals during World War II. By the end of the war, she was officially credited with stopping 122 enemy soldiers and officers and training more than 500 new marksmen for the front. In the early years of flight, the person who designed a new plane often had to be the first to fly it. When the chief engineer was also the test pilot, weak designs tended to disappear very quickly. Soviet leaders Vyacheslav Molotov, Joseph Stalin, Mikhail Kalinin, and Kliment Voroshilov stand among delegates at the 16th Party Congress in Moscow, July 1930. The group directing the first big wave of Soviet industrial growth still poses here in plain, almost worker-style coats instead of luxury suits. This playful fake scene shows 3 astronauts in suits posing as if the whole Apollo 16 crew is resting on the moon. In the real 1972 mission, only John Young and Charles Duke walked on the moon, while Thomas Mattingly stayed alone in lunar orbit. 12-year-old Ivan Cheredilin works at a heavy lathe in a Soviet factory in 1942, standing on stacked boards to reach the controls. He mastered the trade in only 6 months, one of many children who quietly took over skilled factory jobs while adults were away at the front. In 1939 in the United States, researchers ran speech tests on orphans and tried to make fluent children begin to stutter. The plan failed to change their speech, but many of the children later lived with long-term emotional and nerve problems from the experiment. Soviet sapper Alexei Shcherbakov stands beside a photo of the ferry he helped save during the Dnieper crossing in October 1943. When the loaded ferry was hit, he swam with the mooring rope, pulled it into shallow water, and then carried wounded men to the shore in his arms. In July 1906, National Geographic printed some of the first photos of wild animals taken at night, including this image of deer caught in mid-jump. For readers used only to studio scenes, these ghost-like shapes frozen by flash looked almost like visitors from another world. Victorian-era women training as doctors pose for a group portrait with their classroom skeleton. In an age when many medical schools still refused female students, this quiet photo shows a small group already breaking the rules of their time. A huge saltwater crocodile lies on a small rail cart after being caught in the Johnstone River near Innisfail, Australia, around 1903. These reptiles can grow longer than 6 meters, making them some of the largest living predators on Earth. Factory workers from the Tikhvin railcar plant walk with American actor Tommy Lee Jones through the mud after a day of filming in Tikhvin, Soviet Union, 1983. For one evening, the movie star's path back to the hotel looked more like a friendly village escort than a red carpet. Private Vasily Puchin of a Soviet hunting detachment lies with his comrades on the Bryansk front in World War II. In only a few months of action, he stopped 37 enemy tanks using just hand-thrown charges and burning bottles. Rural women around 35 years old sit and stand by wooden houses in the early 20th century. Hard field work, many children, and almost no modern medicine made faces age far faster than we expect today. Swiss physicist Heinrich Greinacher worked on the magnetron, a high-frequency tube that could heat food. This strange metal block later became the heart of the microwave ovens found in kitchens across the world. This old photograph shows an escape artist prisoner known as Mundir Joe. He broke out of so many jails that officers built a special cell just for him, and he slipped out of that one too. The last Qing ruler Puyi sits on the throne in Beijing, dressed in rich court robes and framed by carved screens. In the imperial court, it was said that Chinese emperors wore each formal outfit only once before it was stored away or passed on, a quiet sign of almost endless luxury. Stacks of Adolf Hitler's book are sold in Germany in the 1930s, while his portrait looks down from a poster. Decades later, DNA tests of 39 living relatives suggested that his own family line included branches linked to both Jewish and African groups, a quiet twist to his ideas about perfect origin. Then Prince Charles walks through the grounds of Cambridge University with his bodyguard in the late 1960s. According to a famous story, the guard joined every class talk, sat the final exams, and scored high enough to be given a degree too. During World War II, a black and white cat from the German battleship Bismarck was rescued by British sailors after the ship sank and made their new ships his home. He lived through the loss of Bismarck, the destroyer Cossack, and the carrier Ark Royal. British Royal Marines stand with a machine gun in a street in Reykjavik, Iceland, during World War II. In May 1940, only 746 Marines were enough for Britain to take control of the island without a single shot fired. On 22 November 1941, trucks began crossing the frozen surface of Lake Ladoga on the Road of Life to reach besieged Leningrad. In the winters that followed, this thin ice highway carried food in and people out, quietly deciding whether a great city would fall or survive. Soviet prisoners of war in striped uniforms moved stone blocks in a German quarry on 8 July 1942. That summer, a new order sent almost all captured Red Army soldiers into forced labor projects across Germany, where many never returned home. A wrecked train lies twisted off the rails near Drohobych in occupied Eastern Europe, 6 July 1942. That summer, German forces started a major hunt for Soviet partisans in these forests after repeated sabotage had already turned the rail lines into dangerous traps for supply trains. On 6 July 1945, the United States began Operation Overcast, a program to bring German scientists to America after the war. Many of the men in this group later worked on rockets, jets, and early nuclear research that shaped both the Cold War and the space race. Soviet and British flags fly from newly built tanks as workers pose with a banner reading, "All Help Russia Now," June 11, 1942. That month, the United States and the USSR signed a Lend-Lease aid pact, unlocking a stream of Allied machines, food, and raw materials for the Eastern Front. An Allied airman sits inside the Link trainer, a mechanical flight simulator invented by Edwin Link in 1929. Before and during World War II, this device trained more than 500,000 pilots on the ground, sharply cutting training crashes. In the early 1920s, Westinghouse's KDKA station in Pittsburgh turned radio from a hobby for amateurs into a new kind of public broadcast. Vice President Harry P. Davis pushed the idea that radio could speak to millions at once across huge distances. A British soldier with a warning flag watches over a Charlton versus Arsenal match during World War II. Even a simple football game in London needed an air raid lookout in case enemy planes appeared over the stadium. Construction crews carved the Twin Liberty tunnels through Mount Washington in Pittsburgh in the early 1920s. When they opened in 1924, these almost 2-kilometer-long road tunnels finally linked the growing South Hills to downtown without the slow climb over the hill. Captured German bombers stand in neat rows in Gorky Park, Moscow in 1943, their crosses still visible on the tails. Visitors could walk past Heinkel and Focke-Wulf planes that once flew in raids, now turned into a silent open-air museum of the war. Workers in Pittsburgh use a huge drilling rig to bite into the rock of Mount Washington for the new Fort Pitt Tunnel in 1958. When the tunnel opened in 1960, drivers shot out of this hole straight into one of the most dramatic city skyline views in America. In Utqiagvik, the northernmost town in Alaska, the sun sets in late November and does not rise again until late January. For about 67 days, people live by streetlights, moonlight, and faint polar twilight, while the sky never becomes full day. After World War II, a Jewish group called the Avengers gathers with rifles around a crowded table. They quietly tracked former German perpetrators across Europe, planning their own hard answers to the crimes of the war. Joe DiMaggio walks with Marilyn Monroe during their brief Hollywood marriage in the 1950s. After she died, he reportedly sent red roses to her resting place for 20 years, never married again, and told friends near the end that he would soon see Marilyn once more. In the early 1970s, schoolgirl Julianne Kopsky fell from a broken plane over the Peruvian rainforest, still strapped into her seat. She survived a drop of more than 3 kilometers and walked alone for 10 days through the jungle, the only survivor of the accident. 2 early cars race along a dusty country road in Ohio in the 1890s. A famous story says the state had only these 2 cars in 1895, and their drivers still managed to bump into each other. Passengers sit in canvas seats inside a converted military transport plane flying from Puerto Rico to New York in 1946. After World War II, many surplus cargo planes like this were quickly turned into low-cost airliners for the first big wave of mass air travel. Racing driver Louis Chevrolet, co-founder of the Chevrolet car brand, later worked as a mechanic in American auto shops. After selling his stake in the company that carried his name, he spent his final years with little money, while Chevrolet grew into a giant. At Fiat's Lingato plant in Turin, Italy, new cars were tested on a racetrack built on the factory roof in 1929. After racing a few laps above the city, each car rolled down spiral ramps straight to the street-level showroom. On 10 September 1950, Brazil aired its first regular television broadcast from a news station in São Paulo. Families soon gathered around glowing screens like this, watching live shows that turned television into the country's favorite evening ritual. Frida Kahlo stands in her garden in Mexico City in the 1940s, the Mexican artist known for both bold art and a turbulent marriage to Diego Rivera. When Rivera had romantic affairs, she sometimes formed her own ties with the same women, turning his behavior into part of her fierce and unconventional life story. A Qajar-era noblewoman from Persia, late 19th century, is often wrongly shared online as Princess Qajar. In that time and place, traits like a fuller body and even a faint mustache were seen as marks of beauty among high-status women. 16-year-old Catherine Gilnog, an Irish passenger on Titanic, later posed for this calm studio photo. During the night of the disaster, she quietly stepped into a lifeboat, thinking the strange boat change was just part of the trip, and only learning the truth when she reached New York. Commuters sit shoulder to shoulder on a mid-20th century train, each hidden behind a newspaper. Long before smartphones, people already spent their journeys alone with their own media, instead of talking to each other. After the Chernobyl reactor accident in April 1986, 3 volunteer plant workers entered flooded tunnels under the core to open valves and drain the water. Their night dive helped prevent a feared second blast that might have spread heavy contamination across large parts of Europe. The musicians on the real Titanic stayed on deck and played music as the ship sank in April 1912. All 8 members of the band lost their lives that night, and their calm performance became one of the most famous stories from the disaster. Australian rower Henry Bobby Pearce is seen in his single scull around the time of the 1928 Olympic Games. In one famous race, he stopped rowing to let a family of ducks cross his lane, then calmly pulled ahead again and still won with a record time. Albert Einstein is often said to have given books instead of flowers, saying that flowers last only a few days, but a good book is for life. For him, pages of ideas were a deeper gift than any bouquet. 2 miners pose at a California claim in the late 19th century, wearing the tough work pants that would soon be called jeans. In 1873, Levi Strauss and Jacob Davis patented these riveted denim trousers for gold seekers, and they quietly became one of the most copied pieces of clothing on Earth. In December 1945, 5 U.S. Navy planes on a training flight known as Flight 19 flew out over the Bermuda Triangle and never made it back to base. No confirmed wreckage or crew were ever found, helping turn this routine mission into one of the sea's most famous mysteries. Women in striped coats stand together just after a prison camp was opened by Allied troops at the end of World War II. On one wall, a prisoner left a line saying that after what they had lived through, even heaven itself would have to ask them for forgiveness. Princess Isabel of Brazil looks up at the sky in Paris in 1906, watching her friend Alberto Santos Dumont guide his 14 bis plane. That short flight over the Bagatelle field became one of the first officially recorded powered flights in the world. Hungarian-American physicist Maria Telkes and architect Eleanor Raymond built this experimental solar-heated house in Dover, Massachusetts in 1947. Its wall panels stored sunlight and salt to release warmth later, making it one of the first homes in the world warmed almost only by the sun. In 1951, 66-year-old Swede Gustav Håkansson was refused entry to a 1,600-kilometer bicycle race for being too old, so he rode unofficially anyway. After 5 days and a few hours in the saddle, he reached the finish long before the official racers, earning the nickname Grandpa of Steel. Julia Butterfly Hill lived on a small platform high in a 1,500-year-old redwood tree in California in the late 1990s. She stayed up there for 738 days without coming down until the logging company agreed to save the giant tree and the forest around it. On the 1931 set of Frankenstein, 7-year-old Marilyn Harris stands by the lake holding hands with Boris Karloff in full monster makeup. The crew expected her to be terrified, but she ran straight to him, asked, "May I drive with you?" and rode happily to the scene beside the monster. In 1988, the diner chain Denny's chose to close for Christmas and discovered many restaurants had no keys or door locks at all. About 700 locations had to rush and install locks for the very first time. London streets disappeared under the Great Smog in December 1952, when coal smoke and fog turned the city into a gray maze. In just 4 days, the haze was so thick that traffic stopped, flights were grounded, and thousands of people lost their lives. Coal miners ride a moving conveyor belt deep underground to reach the workface faster, mid-20th century. So-called man-riding belts were once common in mines, but later became heavily restricted after many serious conveyor accidents. Miners pack into man-cage elevators at the Republic Steel Company iron mine in Mineville, New York, 1943. These open platforms could drop dozens of men hundreds of meters underground in a few minutes to keep steel production running at full speed. Mine Rescue Brigade members trained with early self-contained breathing apparatus in Britain, 1934. These bulky oxygen rebreathers let them enter smoke-filled tunnels for up to 2 hours to pull trapped miners out alive. Cadeby Colliery Mine Rescue Team stands with their breathing gear, oxygen cylinders, and a canary cage in Yorkshire, England, 1948. These volunteers trained to walk into toxic gas after underground emergencies, using birds and early Novox sets to warn them seconds before the air became unbreathable. An early DOSCO NCB dint header cuts low coal roadways for retreat mining in a British pit, mid-20th century. Its spinning drum bristling with picks could carve rock far faster than hand drilling in tunnels barely high enough for a miner to crawl. After World War I, a deaf veteran sits with his wife and the enormous family that grew from a promise she made before he left. Together they raised 20 children and built a home where everyone communicated with sign as naturally as with speech. Sergeant Mobley of the British 2nd Warwickshire Regiment mans a Browning 30 M1919 machine gun from inside a shattered house, January 1945. This American-made gun became one of the most widespread Allied support weapons of the conflict. During the Cold War, Chrysler built giant air raid sirens powered by a V8 car engine and mounted on rooftops or trailers. Each one blasted about 138 dB and could be heard up to roughly 16 miles away, making them among the loudest warning sirens ever created. In medieval Europe, head lice were so widespread that removing them became a normal shared routine. Families and friends would sit together, talk, and patiently comb one another's hair to pick out the insects. German POWs stand behind barbed wire in a Canadian camp during World War II. Conditions were so fair that many tried to stay in Canada or later returned there instead of going home. The SS Minnow on Gilligan's Island was actually a 1964 Wheeler cabin cruiser with a cruising speed of only about 12 knots. At that speed, the famous 3-hour tour could never have taken them more than roughly 41 miles from port, making the show's castaway premise mathematically impossible. Samson, a 19th century Shire horse from Bedfordshire, England, grew to a record 21.212 hands, about 2.19 meters, making him the tallest horse ever measured. Nicknamed Mammoth, he weighed around 359 pounds, turning a quiet farm worker into a living giant of horse history. An Australian driver lets his horse drink at an Australian Comforts Fund stall in Longueval, France during World War I. Over 130,000 horses served with the Australian forces in the war, but only one is officially recorded as returning home. In 1970, a U.S. Air Force F-106 Interceptor in Montana kept flying by itself after the pilot ejected during a training dive and then gently slid to a stop in a snowy field. The jet was repaired, returned to service, and its strange solo landing is still studied as one of aviation's most bizarre flukes. In 1967, Munich resident Helmut G. Winter built a homemade catapult to fire potato dumplings at low-flying, noisy Luftwaffe planes over his house. The story goes that after enough starch-filled salvos, the pilots quietly changed their flight path. In 1938, a forester in what is now eastern Germany planted larch trees inside a pine forest, so their autumn colors would outline a giant emblem of the ruling party, visible only from the air. The hidden design stayed unnoticed until aerial surveys in 1992 exposed it. Open-air schools in Europe and North America kept children studying outside on porches and courtyards, even in freezing winters around 1900–1920. Teachers believed that cold, fresh air prevented illness better than warm classrooms, so pupils learned lessons wrapped in blankets and coats. During World War II in Darwin, Australia, an Air Force dog named Gunner could hear incoming aircraft long before radar picked them up. Ground crews trusted his reaction so much that his ears became an early warning system for Japanese raids and for telling friendly planes apart from enemy ones. Electronic music pioneer Wendy Carlos at her Moog synthesizer in New York, early 1970s. She revolutionized film soundtracks with her synthesizer scores for A Clockwork Orange, The Shining, and Tron, pushing electronic sound into mainstream cinema. In 1955, 67-year-old Emma Grandma Gatewood quietly set out alone to hike the entire 2,168-mile Appalachian Trail in basic canvas sneakers. She finished the trail 3 times by age 75, inspiring modern long-distance hiking with nothing more than a blanket, a shower curtain. Gertrude Ederle, a New York-born swimmer, became the first woman to cross the English Channel in 1926. She finished in 14 hours 31 minutes, beating the men's record by nearly 2 hours despite rough seas. In 1951, 66-year-old Swede Gustaf Håkansson secretly joined the 1-800 Sverigegaloppet bicycle race after officials rejected him as too old. He rode almost without sleep, finished far ahead of the official competitors, and became a national legend known as Grandpa Steele. NASA engineer Judith Love Cohen helped design the emergency guidance system that brought the Apollo 13 crew safely home in 1970. On the day she went into labor, she took her calculations to the hospital, finished the problem from her bed. Henry Moseley, the English physicist who proved that atomic number defines each element, volunteered for frontline service in World War I. After his death in combat at age 27, Britain quietly decided that top researchers were too valuable to send to the front lines. In the 1880s, American farmers in remote parts of the U.S. turned their barbed wire fences into makeshift telephone networks, linking up to 20 homes. All the phones rang together on these barbed wire party lines, turning lonely homesteads into one big neighborhood chat line. Around 1900 in the United States, electric cars like this one were the quiet luxury choice on city streets. At the dawn of the 20th century, electric cars and taxis made up about 1/3 of all vehicles on American roads before gasoline engines took over. Brogan's 10 HP Doodlebug microcar, 1944, could reach about 45 miles and nearly 70 miles on a single gallon of fuel. It was an ultralight 3-wheeler aimed at giving wartime America cheap personal transport long before modern microcars. In 1952, a stray tabby cat wandered into an elementary classroom in California and simply stayed. Over the next 16 years, he attended lessons every day, becoming the school's unofficial student who never missed a single roll call. In 1956, Harper Lee's friends gifted her a full year's salary so she could stop working and focus on writing. She used that time to complete To Kill a Mockingbird, which has sold over 30 million copies and is still studied in schools worldwide. Playwright George Bernard Shaw worked in a tiny 64-square-foot hut he built in his English garden. It sat on a circular track so he could roll it with the sun, and he jokingly named it London so visitors could be told he was away in the capital. During the Second World War, Indian Maharaja Jamsaheb Digvijay Singhji opened his estate in Jamnagar to hundreds of Polish women and children fleeing occupied Europe. In gratitude, Poland later named a school after him, so his quiet rescue would be remembered in the classroom every day. Bessie Coleman, born to a sharecropping family in Texas, had to move to Paris in 1920 to learn to fly because no American flight school would train her. In 1921, she earned an international pilot's license, becoming the first African American and Native American woman pilot. In April 1912, young tennis player Richard Norris Williams survived the Titanic disaster and spent so long in the freezing Atlantic that doctors on the rescue ship wanted to remove both his legs. He refused, recovered through brutal rehab. Ground crew in World War II feed a 27-foot ammunition belt into the wing of a U.S. fighter plane. Many people claim this length inspired the phrase, "the whole 9 yards," but historians and linguists have never found real evidence for that. Drifters in early 20th century America weren't all the same in slang. People distinguished between tramps, bums, and hobos. A tramp wandered and avoided work, a bum neither traveled nor worked, and a hobo was a traveling laborer who followed temporary jobs. During World War II, film star Bette Davis ran the Hollywood Canteen in Los Angeles, where Allied service members could eat, dance, and watch shows completely free. Top movie stars took shifts serving food, washing dishes, and performing on stage as a living thank you to the troops. May Bradford, a Red Cross volunteer in World War I hospitals, spent her days beside wounded soldiers who could not write home. She hand-wrote over 25,000 letters for them, often becoming the last voice their families ever received. In 1910, Irish aviator Lillian Bland flew the Mayfly, the first airplane designed, built, and piloted by a woman, over Randallstown in Northern Ireland. She famously improvised its fuel system with a whiskey bottle and her own lungs to pressurize it, years before Amelia Earhart ever took to the sky. Zit Kala Shah, a Yankton, Dakota writer and musician born in 1876 on the Yankton Reservation in South Dakota, poses with her violin. She later collected indigenous stories in English, co-wrote the first Native American opera, and co-founded the National Council of American Indians to defend her people's rights. Citroën engineers in occupied France in 1940 quietly altered the oil dipsticks on trucks built for the German army. The lowered fill line made engines run low on oil and seize during hard use, disabling vehicles from the inside. Typical weekly food ration for one adult in Britain in 1943. A few ounces of bacon, butter, sugar, tea, cheese, cooking fat, jam, sweets, and just one egg. Rationing this strict in the UK continued until 1954, long after the fighting ended. In 1921, the U.S. submarine USS R-14 ran out of fuel about 100 miles from Hawaii while searching for a missing tug. With no radio and only a week of food, the crew turned blankets and mattress covers into makeshift sails and slowly sailed the stranded sub back to Hawaii over 5 days. In February 1975, officials in Haicheng, China, noticed frantic behavior in dogs and other animals and ordered about 90,000 residents to evacuate. Just hours later, a 7.3 magnitude earthquake leveled nearly 90% of the city's buildings, making it one of the few quakes people escaped after an official warning. Early hipsters were 1940s jazz fans, and the later word hippie grew out of this same slang for people who were hip to the music scene. The counterculture kids of the 1960s basically borrowed the label from those cool nightclub regulars of their grandparents' generation. Christopher Reeve during his intense weight training regimen to transform into Superman for the 1978 film. With coaching from bodybuilder David Prowse, he added about 30 pounds of muscle to become the Man of Steel. Unable to have children of his own, chocolate magnate Milton Hershey founded the Milton Hershey School in Pennsylvania in 1909 for orphaned and disadvantaged children. He placed 30% of all future Hershey profits into a trust for the school, now worth billions, and even banned the company from using it in advertising. In 1989, NHL goalie Clint Malarchuk suffered a life-threatening neck injury during a game, but forced himself to skate off the ice because he knew his mother was watching on TV. As medical staff fought to stabilize him, he asked a team employee to call her just to say he loved her. At 17, pitcher Jackie Mitchell struck out Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig in back-to-back at-bats during a 1931 exhibition game in Chattanooga, Tennessee. Shortly after, Major League Baseball's commissioner voided her contract as too strenuous for women, right after she dominated its biggest stars. In the trenches of World War I, British soldiers swore so constantly that strong curse words became background noise. A plain command like, "Get your rifles," suddenly felt more serious than a shouted insult, because it meant something was truly wrong. German long jumper Lutz Long and American Jesse Owens sit together at the 1936 Berlin Olympics, where Owens was one foul away from elimination in the long jump. Long quietly advised his rival on adjusting his run-up, helping Owens qualify and win gold. A veiled woman poses for a studio portrait in the late 1800s, her hands folded tightly over an ornate patterned dress. Dark mourning images like this later inspired internet legends about vampire queens and other invented Gothic tales. Parts of northeastern France, called the Red Zone, are former World War I battlefields that remain closed more than a century later. The ground is so contaminated with buried metal and chemicals that farming, building, and tourism are still banned there. In 1014, Saxon forces reportedly rode up the Thames and pulled down an early wooden London bridge to break Danish control of London. Some historians think this dramatic attack later echoed in the nursery rhyme, "London Bridge is falling down." A milk seller pushes a handcart loaded with cans through Piccadilly in London's West End in 1916, while a customer counts his coins nearby. With many delivery men away at the front, thousands of women like her kept British cities supplied with daily milk by hand. Near Icelandic geysers, locals bury pots of dough in the hot ground and mark each spot with a stone. Over about 24 hours, the earth slowly bakes it into dense rye bread called havre browed, made entirely with geothermal heat. At the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair, an ice cream seller who ran out of cups teamed up with a neighboring Syrian pastry vendor who rolled his thin waffles into makeshift cones. The edible containers were such a hit with visitors that the ice cream cone trend spread across the United States within a few years. In 1986, Australian batsman Dean Jones scored a marathon 2:10 in extreme heat during a test match in Chennai, India, while severely dehydrated. He went straight from the field to hospital on a drip, and his innings is still ranked among the greatest in cricket history. In 1932, Brazilian athletes sailed to the Los Angeles Olympics on a ship loaded with coffee they sold in each port to pay for the voyage. By the time they reached California, they'd spent weeks as traveling merchants, but still marched into the Olympic Stadium to represent Brazil. April 1945, as Soviet troops closed in, German forces allegedly loaded an armored train with gold, art, and valuables in Breslau and sent it toward Waldenburg, disappearing into Poland's Owl Mountains. Decades of searches, ground-penetrating radar scans, and tunnel explorations have never produced solid evidence that this gold train ever existed, keeping the legend alive. In 1922, the silent feature The Power of Love became the world's first 3D movie, using red and green anaglyph glasses in American cinemas. Viewers could literally choose the movie's fate, seeing either a tragic or happy ending simply by looking through a different colored lens. In 1937, Oklahoma grocer Sylvan Goldman introduced the first shopping carts, but shoppers thought they looked strange and refused to use them. He secretly hired models to stroll the aisles with carts for 2 years until customers finally copied them and changed supermarket life forever. In the 1950s, NASA recruited deaf volunteers with inner ear damage to study how the human body might handle spaceflight. In brutal open-sea tests, the hearing researchers were soon doubled over with seasickness, while the deaf crew calmly played cards on deck. Conjoined twins Chang and Eng Bunker left Siam, became U.S. citizens in North Carolina, and built a large rural household with their wives, who were sisters. In 1865, only Eng's name came up in the Civil War draft, so the pair avoided combat because the Army had no rule for drafting 2 men joined in one body. In New England in 1692, a woman could be labeled a witch for being too old, too young, too poor, too rich, or simply stubborn. Even a birthmark, spoiled milk, or a noisy argument could be twisted into proof of witchcraft and hauled before the Salem courts. In 1692, hysteria in Salem led to 19 people being executed as witches on the basis of rumors and spectral evidence. This meme twists that history to suggest that open, affectionate women are still judged like heretics for breaking social rules. In 1912, Australian geologist Douglas Mawson led a 3-man scientific expedition deep into Antarctica's Commonwealth Bay. After losing both companions in a crevasse accident, he walked alone for weeks across the ice and reached base camp only hours after the relief ship had sailed away. Apollo 11 astronauts sit inside a mobile quarantine trailer aboard USS Hornet, while President Richard Nixon greets them after their return from the moon, July 1969. NASA kept the crew isolated for 21 days to make sure no unknown lunar microbes were brought back to Earth.